So this is your ideal employee, right? Look at her. She's professional. She's got the latest in equipment. She's probably very smart. But actually, she's not really your ideal employee, is she? I think if you are in the business of hiring creative people, this probably is your ideal employee. Or if they don't look like that on the outside, which they probably don't, they look like that on the inside, right? They're creatives, after all. And so I want to title this presentation, People Are Strange, because they are. And specifically, I want to talk about how we can manage creative teams, whether we're talking developers or marketing people or designers. We have to deal with the messy business of human affairs, and do that with many times over as we grow our business. So, what do I mean by people are strange? Well, I mean many things. There are many kinds of strangeness. For instance, there is the shapeshifter. The shapeshifter is the personality who you can never count on being the same tomorrow as they were yesterday. They're a particular challenge. I've had to deal with many shapeshifters in my time in business, including some CEOs I've hired, and it requires special skills to deal with them. The impossible person. The impossible person is somebody who can't be told that they're wrong. They are always right, and they require special handling. There's the overthinker. Now, they're easy to detect because they have a hard time making decisions, hard time executing on the things they're supposed to execute, because they can find 5 ways of doing it. And then there's my favorite, the restless soul. These are the wanderers of the world. They're really excited about your product for a month, and then they find something else that captures their imagination. I had a business partner co-founder who was a restless soul. And we fortunately were honest about it and parted ways before it got to be too much of a problem. So many kinds of strange, many kinds of challenges we have when we're building teams. I want to talk about how we can rise above the crazy. So before I totally dive into a little bit of methodology, I wanted to introduce myself. So I've been doing internet companies and building creative teams for a embarrassingly long time, since the mid-90s. My first company was a web development firm that I sold to a company called Frog Design, which maybe some of you have heard of. They have European offices. They were famous for designing the original Macintosh computer. Now they have a very large digital team. There I learned to work in an agency situation with many types of crazies from many different nationalities. A few years ago, I started a company called Get Satisfaction with 2 co-founders. Actually 3 and then 2. Get Satisfaction was a classic Silicon Valley startup, raised venture capital, and is today still going strong. Over, about 80,000 business customers and 25 million monthly visitors. So big software play now, and learned a lot about the pressures of fast growth startups there and elsewhere. My current gig is, as mentioned, was a company called Off Grid Electric, which is doing solar energy as a service in the developing world. And here I'm learning a whole new set of lessons about managing teams. This company has grown from a few dozen employees to over 300 today, plus another 500 contractors out in the field doing various jobs. And we're having to create structures to manage both the rapid growth, because by the end of this year we'll have 800 employees and over 1,500 contractors. So very different kinds of scaling needs when you're growing teams like this. You can't reinvent the wheel every time you bring on a new employee when you have that kind of growth. But I realize that most of you are growing from maybe a few employees to a few more, maybe a few dozen. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to coordinate that kind of methodical early stage growth, because you're building the basis for the future of your business. You're creating the DNA of the business with each hire. So my assertion is that people management is fractal. And those of you who know what a fractal is, it's a self-repeating pattern, right? It's the same at the small scale as it is at the large scale. So here, the small scale are each part of managing a team, from the beginning of finding your staff all the way to the development and perhaps termination of your staff. So, but the relationship overall can be found. The seeds of that relationship can be found in each part of that, each stage of that relationship. So those stages are finding, converting, i.e. bringing them into the business, onboarding them, how do they get to know the business and learn what success looks like, motivating them, which means mapping their internal interests to yours, developing them. This means extending their natural strengths into ways that they didn't realize were possible before, and course correcting along the way as the business changes, as they change, as you change. So here it is in a simple phrase that the first 3 months are equivalent to the first 3 years. You will find those patterns that you establish in the first 3 months repeating themselves over and over again throughout the lifetime of that relationship. And you're lucky if your employee relationship lasts for much longer than 3 years, but if so, then it would be the first 4, 5, 6 plus years. So the way I'm going to talk through some of the lessons that I've learned, some of the tools, is by telling you about 2 characters. These are composites, not real people, certainly not their real pictures. One is Stacy, and she's our ideal employee. She's the employee we're trying to build through great practices. And then there's Pepe. Pepe is kind of a disaster. We'll talk about why he's a disaster. But so we have the good case and the bad case. So starting with finding, can anybody tell me what this is? A fly trap, right? So echoing some of what we heard in the last presentation, the way in which we find people, which we do that initial connection, can matter so much. So I really like the idea of beyond the checklist of items you do for hiring, setting up fly traps for ideal employees, the ideal talent that you're looking for. And by fly trap, I mean create attractors that only the people who have certain qualities will respond to. And so I did this recently with a job that I'm trying to fill, which is a director of engineering job. Since my current company is in Africa and my team is distributed, what I decided is that I had to play up these factors. I had to find people who wanted to be distributed, who wanted to travel to Africa and go on safari. So I played that up. Like basically, this job comes with safaris. That's the tagline. It's below the fold. But this job comes with safaris. If you don't want safaris, if you don't like Africa, if you don't like travel, if you don't like distributed teams, do not apply. Okay. So separating the good candidates from the bad candidates becomes automatic when you approach this from a fly trap scenario. So in the case of Stacy, she was irresistibly drawn to. She was one of a small number of candidates who applied for this job. The job had very high standards already, so it wasn't that many people who were qualified. But of the people who were qualified, a small number of them really were willing to travel and work on a distributed team. So and beyond that, there was something about electrifying the 1.5 billion people who don't have power that made her feel like that was meaningful. So that wouldn't be true for everybody, but for her it was. So from the very beginning, we're set up for success because our interests are aligned. Okay, let's talk about Pepe. So Pepe was referred by a friend. Now, we talk about how much we like referrals, right? Referrals are great. For referrals from employees existing in the business, referrals from friends or family. What could be better than somebody who knows the candidates telling them that they should join? Well, the problem is that this may be the most meaningful connection you have to this candidate. I've hired many great candidates through referrals, but I would just warn you that there's some traps to that. So Pepe was introduced to us by a friend, and while he thought the business that we were doing was interesting and he could talk about it, really what came through was that he hated his current job. And so right off the bat, we had a problem. Retrospectively, we could see that if this is the common, this is what brought you together, it's not the basis for a long-term relationship. So let's talk about conversions. So finding somebody, of course, is the first step. And the way in which we get to yes, and the way that we get to that first day in the job is so important for what happens afterwards. We know that when people have a high cost of entry into getting into a club or a job, that they will value it more. They'll project value onto it, right? And actually the retention rates go up much higher levels than otherwise would be true. And this is in many universities, they have fraternities or sororities, and this has been studied, the hazing rituals that people go through. Really horrible hazing rituals where they'll inflict pain, psychological damage, threats, etc. And when the people who make it through the hazing process are so unlikely to leave once they're in that we can learn some things from this. We don't want to inflict physical pain on our potential employees, but putting them through the ringer, making sure that they understand that you only hire the best. You only hire people who understand the mission. Becomes it sets the roots down for them valuing that position over time. And the second part of being inducted into a club, beyond getting in, is the celebration once they've passed the tests, right? It's that feeling that not only did they make it through, they're good enough, but that you recognize that they're good enough. And so whether that's the announcement of their being added to the employee list, or a party, or whatever you do, that's a critical component of being inducted into the club. So Pepe, by contrast, was a convenient hire. We were short-staffed, and we needed somebody post-haste, and so we were unable to put him through the ringer. In fact, he was unable to share any of his work with us. He's a designer, and he was unable to share his work because, as he put it, it was all secret. It was all owned by the company, and therefore he couldn't share it. We decided to not care so much about the fact that he could not share his work with us. So, and we needed him on the job right away, so we invited him to start working without any fanfare. As a result, he did not value the job very, very highly, and that showed itself over time as we began to work with him. So onboarding, what does those first few months, first 3 to 4 weeks look like? There are a lot of ways to onboard your new employees. And a lot of the best ways to onboard have to do with the nature of your business. So for instance, Zappos, which is a large online shoe seller and apparel seller on the internet, now owned by Amazon, Zappos is known for its great customer service. And so the way that they onboard all of their employees is they make them do customer service for several weeks and learn everything about interacting with customers. Whether they're an engineer or a designer or in finance, they all do customer service. And that sets the tone for them. With Stacy and with our employees in general, what we prioritize is identifying what that first win is going to look like. So there are many things that can constitute a win at various timescales, right? Launching a new product, building a new feature. The question that we ask for our new employees is, what is the first win that they can get to? And then work backwards from that. And ideally, many times that first win should be a very small one. What could they do in a week? And there's two benefits to this. One benefit is that you have set them up for success. They recognize that, and ideally they achieve this goal. But if they are not, then you have a very early warning system for this perhaps not being a good fit. So look for that first win. Secondly, identify from the beginning what they own. Now maybe you start off with a very small domain that they own, but oftentimes what we find is that it's easier to tell people that here's a set of tasks and we'll decide what you own later after you've proven yourself. It's far better to define very upfront what they own now from the very beginning. And even if that's small, and that you ultimately expand that. One of the greatest drivers for people is a sense of autonomy in their work. And so part of giving somebody autonomy is having ownership of something. And then finally, avoiding silos was a critical ingredient for Stacy's success. She could talk to anybody in the business. Of course, now that we have Slack is, and other tools like that, HipChat, et cetera, these are incredibly useful tools for blurring the lines between different areas of work. And so this allows Stacy to be a fly on the wall of conversations. As she's a developer, she can eavesdrop in the sales conversations or marketing conversations. She's able to include that new information into her work. So these are critical ingredients for all of our employees. Even in Africa, where we have staff that are out in in little villages, they can come back to the office and look at Slack and be part of the software development team's work. So this works at every level of the business. Now, Pepe, by contrast, was thrown right into a failing project. That's, again, we were desperate for somebody, and we had a project that was not going well. So of course we put him on the failing project. Now, given that we had no rails on this project, we were hoping that he would figure it out. He was immediately set up for failure. And we didn't define what a clearly defined quick win could be. And so this just compounded itself to creating ill will from him towards us. Secondly, because he wasn't able to spend time learning about how the business worked, he was thrown right into this failed project. He used a set of generic tools, patterns that he'd used on other projects that didn't relate that much to this project. So getting people outside of their standard generic tools and into a set of solutions that they've developed for the task at hand is critical. The motto that he used, because we did not set up very clear definitions of success, was, well, we'll know success when we see it. This is a danger sign. Avoid this at all costs. Define success ahead of time at whatever level you can. So I don't know if you have motivational speakers in Poland, but that's what one looks like. And of course, this is not how we motivate our own employees. The way we do it is, as we did with Stacy, is we spent time, not just in the interview process, but with regular reviews, one-on-ones that I spent with her each week, understanding what her motivations are, what her passions are. So as it turns out, she had a number of passions, and I think this is true for most creative talent. One of those passions was cryptography. And she was very interested in cryptocurrencies and new ways to authenticate people. And so we very early on identified that we could leverage this passion with some longer-term projects that weren't really on our radar. They weren't pressing items for us, but we knew they would become eventually. And so we granted her 10% of her time to begin to develop simple prototypes around these areas. And this did a number of transformative things. One is she was able to map her passions onto ours. Secondly, she was able to share this with other team members and pull people along with her. And that allowed her to build respect with her team members and for them to help her out as she built her prototypes. And then, of course, it was great for us as the company because about 3 months later, a new partner required that we do some new things with our authentication, and we already had this built. So we had the sort of serendipitous upside of leveraging her experience here. Second thing I wanted to talk about is that people have different psychological motivations, different personality types. It's essential to understand where people are coming from. A simple method, and there are many, but a simple method is the power, achievement, support paradigm. So some people are motivated by accumulating power, not in a bad way, not in a totalitarian kind of way, but from the standpoint of being a good manager, right? They like to move people in the right direction, so they're motivated by power. Secondly, achievement. Some people, and I think as entrepreneurs, many of us are definitely, this is our true north. We're motivated by achievement. We want to outdo ourselves. We want to set a personal best. And then there are support people. These are people who are motivated by helping others succeed. And so understanding where people fit along this dimension allows us to support them in that. So in Stacy's case, she was an achievement-oriented individual. She didn't care so much about about becoming a manager of people. She wanted to build stuff, amazing stuff, and create the prestige with her colleagues and with her peers out on the internet. Pepe, unfortunately, we had misdiagnosed, and this is very easy to do. He puts himself, when you're in a startup, people will tell you that they're achievement-oriented, right? They want to build a great startup. But as it turned out, as we discovered over time, he was very motivated by power. Okay. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing if you diagnose it. You could say, okay, you would like to manage people, and we will create a track for doing that. Or you say, we don't have a management track right now, and we are going to have to say goodbye. But the first ingredient is actually diagnosing the psychological motivation of a person effectively. Developing. So Stacy, because she's achievement-oriented, wants to continue to develop in her job and in her craft. And so the question is, what is the right way we can do that? There are many ways, of course. You can give people a budget for going to classes. There are online courses. There are conferences. And in fact, Stacy, we asked her to start to go and make presentations, speeches about her cryptography work. And that allowed her to, again, build the prestige with her colleagues and peers, but also to represent the company. But the 10% rule is something I learned more recently, and I wanted to tell you about it because it's one of the most powerful and simple tools for amplifying a person's strengths. The way this works is at the end of each week, you make a list of the top 2 or 3 or 4 accomplishments you have this week. And don't think too hard about it, but just be very clear about these things we did well, I did well, or they did well, if you're managing them. Next to each of these items, write down how they could do it 10% better. What's interesting about the 10% rule is that it's not how can you do this 100% better or 1,000% better. It's only 10%, just a little bit better. You can always do something a little bit better. But if you do this each week, over the course of a year, that's thousands of percent better. It's compound interest. And so this is how you make a superstar, is implement the 10% rule. And this will do wonders for their own sense of progress. They'll be able to see it from week to week, especially if you track this somewhere in writing. And of course, you get the benefit of the superstar that you're helping to nurture. Pepe, of course, did not take to this kind of coaching from strengths. Pepe saw problems everywhere. And because he focused on problems, we focused on problems. And sometimes it's important to put out the fires and to fix broken things. This is incredibly important. But if this is the basis for your relationship, it will start to feel like everything is broken because there's always another problem. So the 10% rule could have redirected this energy towards positives and I'll probably solve those underlying problems along with it. So a lot of this is reframing to work with people's best selves when sometimes their demons are driving them forward. So correcting along the way is very important as well. And because even if you're doing everything right, things change, right? There are new obstacles and there's new understanding of what success looks like. Stacy is experiment-driven. You probably get the sense already that she's incredibly honest about her strengths and her weaknesses, but very positive in her outlook. And so the way that we worked with her to improve was to create little experiments. Beyond the 10% approach, 10% rule, we would look at new processes that were being proposed in other companies, and we would experiment with them ourselves. And there's a saying in agile development that the most important process is a process for changing the process. And Stacy was able to take this practice and put it into play. So the way that we did this specifically was at the end of each week, we had a retrospective. And she led it with all of our developers, some of our designers and product managers. And she focused on identifying the experiments that we could run to improve our process for the next week. Pepe, unfortunately, figured out what he thought was the right thing to do and gave us ultimatums. Do it this way or I walk. Now, or if you're in normal circumstances, you tell them to walk. But there are times when you feel like your back is up against the wall, right? It took you months to find this designer. And he now knows everything about the business. To replace him will take more months. So, well, gosh, we should probably just do what he says, right? Because that's the lowest risk approach. So what we ended up with Pepe, and I've seen this many times, is a hostage situation where he has all the cards. He is basically dictating how we do things. And what he's dictating is just made up. It's his own biases in play. So as opposed to the experiment-driven approach where we try things and we see what the results are, with Pepe, we had ultimatums. So this is the stage when you see yourself unable to maneuver and unable to push back, that you have to ask yourself if you're willing to be a hostage. And of course, this is an essential part of any relationship, is how we end them. Now with Stacy, we didn't fire her. She was our favorite employee ever. But there was a point upon which because she was a big gamer, she wanted to go and work for a gaming company. And she told us this. She actually told us this for years, that at some point she wanted to do this. And we said, all right, just let us know. Let's just keep the communication lines open. And so she did this. About 6 weeks before she wanted to leave, she told us, and she said she would stay around to help us transition and to train other employees, and she was willing to be an advisor after the fact if any issues came up. So all of the work we had done previously to coach her, to give her autonomy, to invest in her, and to really intertwine her reputation with ours, it continued to play benefits or create benefits even through her departure from the company. So it's actually not cynical at all when you're hiring somebody to think through how it might end. This is the kind of thing a lawyer would do, but sometimes lawyers have a clue. No, I say that lovingly. I love lawyers. Some of my best friends are lawyers. Okay, well, with Pepe, you can imagine what happened. It was a collapse, a total collapse, where he decided one day that even though we'd given him what he wanted, he wanted his own department, separate from the engineers, design without accountability to our agile process. We looked at this as an experiment. That's how we justified it. But for him, it was an ultimatum. And when the engineers began to push back, he didn't want to collaborate with them, and so he walked. And so that led to a collapse because we weren't prepared for it. We had deluded ourselves into thinking that if we went along with him, that it would work out. So what I would recommend is never delude yourself into thinking that a hostage situation can work out. So to summarize, that the first 3 months are equivalent to the first 3 years in the patterns that we create throughout these processes and other processes that I haven't mentioned. So these are just a little bit of the lessons, a few of the lessons that I've learned in implementing methodologies that can build creative teams. So this is me. I'm Tempo on Twitter, and Thor at thormuller.com if you want to talk about building small, medium, or large teams. Thank you.
Thank you, Thor.